Have you been watching the news lately? Probably. Sometimes there's good news. Mostly they're talking about a problem. Occasionally we hear of death. And it's interesting when we hear of a death. When I think about life, there's the beginning, that's our birth, and we celebrated that with William. And then there's the very end, which is, of course, death when we leave this world. But most of us live in the middle of those two bookends. And so we don't pay as much attention in those ends because we're busy living in the middle while we're alive. And because of that, we don't always focus on those last moments or what would happen in the last moments of death. But you may be aware that recently, just a few days ago, the political commentator Charles Krauthammer died. Do you know Charles? Do you know who Charles is? Okay. Charles has a very interesting story. There's actually a documentary on his life tonight on TV. But Charles went to Harvard, and Harvard Medical School, that is. And in his first year, when he was a freshman, he was in the pool, and through a diving accident, he severed his spinal cord, left him a quadriplegic. Many people didn't know that because when you see him on TV, they're filming him from chest up, and he's seated behind a table, but he was always in a wheelchair. They had to wheel him in ahead of time before. He didn't want people to be distracted by the fact that he was in the chair. So he's a quadriplegic, but here's the amazing thing. He went ahead and he graduated. And he did that by studying in a very interesting way. When he was paralyzed, when the accident first happened, he was strapped to a board, because they're trying to let his body heal as best they could. But he wanted to keep studying. And so he had the nurses place in front of him, over his head, two books. And he would read both books at the same time. That's because they didn't have to turn the pages as often. Can you imagine trying to keep your wits in reading from this book and reading from that book? And he goes on, and he becomes a psychiatrist. He practices psychiatry. We know him as the political kind of mind. You've probably seen him, if you have seen him on TV. But most people considered Charles Krauthammer the most thoughtfully intelligent political mind of our time. That's kind of an interesting way to be remembered. Not because of his cutting comments. He wasn't like that. It was very different, very thoughtful, very methodical in the way that he thought about life and politics. So last August, he had a malignant tumor in his abdomen, and they removed that. And he had a few setbacks that went over the past few months, and he disappeared off the TV if you wonder why nobody saw him for a while. He believed until just very recently that he was on the road to recovery and he would be back in front of the TV cameras once again and we'd be able to watch him until 2 weeks ago approximately. And he wrote a message to us. He became aware of something in his life. Remember I talked about those bookends? He became aware of where the end would be. And so he wrote his final words of life and shared them with us. And I just have a little bit here. I just excerpt out of the letter. And I just want to quote a bit of this as we get into the message today. He says, "I've been uncharacteristically silent these past 10 months," the letter began. "I thought that the silence would soon be coming to an end. But I'm afraid I must tell you now that fate has decided on a different course for me. Recent tests have revealed that the cancer has returned. There was no sign of it as recently as a month ago, which means it's aggressive and spreading rapidly. My doctors tell me their best estimate is that I have only a few weeks left to live. This is the final verdict. My fight is over. I leave this life with no regrets. It was a wonderful life, full and complete with great loves and great endeavors that make it worth living. I'm sad to leave, but I leave with the knowledge that I lived the life I intended." Now, that's Charles Krauthammer, eloquent to the end. You ever thought about if you knew when the end was coming? What would you say? What words? Would you write them down? Would you share them? when somebody does know when the end is coming, they have a tremendous opportunity to share their words of life, their words of knowledge, to share treasures that they may want us to know. Sort of a Krauthammer moment. Have you ever had one? A Krauthammer moment? There's just this important word that you love to pass on to the next generation or the current generation. So Jesus also had one of these Krauthammer moments. He knew when the end had come, and he took the opportunity and he wanted to leave that final letter, that final word, those words of knowledge, words of life. And I'd like us all to hear from those words of life today out of John's gospel. Now, before I read this, it's out of John chapter 20, verses 19 to 23, just a bit of background so you understand what's going on in the story. Jesus had been crucified. There had been sights of him being resurrected, but even still, the disciples were hiding away. They were up in that room behind locked doors. They were afraid the Romans were searching for them, and they would fall into the same fate as Jesus. So they didn't know what to do, scared, and basically in hiding. And it's in that condition, in that place, that Jesus shows up. He appears, and he speaks his final message to his very intimate friends. And here's what he says, starting at verse 19. When it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews, as I had said earlier, Jesus came and he stood among them and he said, "Peace be with you." And after this, he showed them his hands and he showed them his sides. Then the disciples rejoiced when they saw the Lord. And Jesus said again to them, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." When he had said this, he breathed on them, and he said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit." Let me stop there. May God bless the reading and the hearing of God's holy word. He gets his opportunity. He has a moment. He knows the end is there. He shares the message. And what's the message? Well, he said peace, but it was something more than that. He said, "As the Father has sent me, so I am now sending you." That's the special word of knowledge, word of life Jesus is sharing. Some say this verse 21 has been called the charter of the church. It's that commissioning of the disciples to carry out his mission to a hurting and lost world. Now, we think about the disciples in that locked room and they go by that name, but something happens, and we celebrate that at Pentecost. There's something that seems to happen where they quit being disciples and we start calling them apostles. Well, this is what happened. It's really found in Jesus' words. They become sent ones. That's the actual Greek there, meaning one who is sent off, apostolos, one who is sent off. It's interesting that Jesus' message is, if you want to understand what's going on, if you want to understand this mission, if you want to understand the meaning behind what I'm telling you, you only need to look to who's sending you. As I was sent, so I send you. Now, it's interesting, if you want to find out how something works, well, what I do is I take it apart. And then normally I can't put it back together, or I have lots of parts left over. I don't know how that works. So, but normally if you want to, a new product comes on the market, say an Apple iPhone, and you happen to be a competitor, what might you do? You might go and buy that Apple iPhone and do what? Take it apart. They call that reverse engineering. The actual definition to reverse engineering is this: the process by which something is deconstructed and examined or analyzed in detail to discover the concepts involved in the manufacturing, usually in order to produce something similar. So if you want to compete with Apple, you buy their phone, you take it apart, you find out how it works, and then you try to use that information to create your, I don't know, what's competitors? Samsung? Yeah, there's lots. I guarantee that's what they did. They found out how it worked, and they wanted to do the same thing. So how did Jesus send? In the same way, just as he said, my Father sent me. So let's do a little reverse engineering. To reverse engineer Jesus' sending, we need to look at how God sent Jesus. He says, hey, I'm going to send you, and I'm going to do it the same way my Father did it for me. So if God sent Jesus in a particular style or means or command, what was that exactly? That'd be good to know. If we can answer that question, how did the Father send Jesus, then we can know how we're sent. And this whole thing of faith doesn't have to be a mystery. This whole thing of what is God's purpose for me in my life, people ask that over and over and over again, and they seem to not have a clue, and here we have it perfectly said. We can know. All we have to do is find out how God sent Jesus. So how did Jesus go where God sent him? We're going to reverse engineer it. He went with a life that contained a message of good news. Good news. He went with a message of abundant life, a life worth living. In other words, he said, I want you to go out and find people, and I want you to make their day. I want you to make their day the best and the greatest it could ever be, because you have the best message and the best means and the best example. Go make their day. Now, you know how my brain works. If you tell me to go make somebody's day and you tell me to do it as Jesus did it, I get a bit literal on those things, and I think, let's see, how did Jesus made somebody's day at a wedding, didn't he? He had some water, and what did he do to it? Well, I'd be over to Robert Mondavi's company right away. Suter Home, any of those great, wine distilleries. I said, I'm going to make your day because I'm going to show you how to turn water into wine. Do you think they'd be happy with me? Maybe. What about, just the way I think. Let's see. Jesus once took a little bit of fish and some bread, and he created a meal for 500. Well, if I'm going to go do as Jesus did and do it in the way that Jesus did it, then I'm probably going to McDonald's, because I see on the McDonald's sign underneath it says billions served. And I would say, I can tell you how to take one hamburger and turn it into 5,000. Would I make their day? Come on, it's a joke. You're supposed to just go with me on this. I got nothing else to say about that, so you got to get with me on it. Okay. It's not about that. That's not how we make somebody's day. That's not the good news or the abundant life. It's more than wine. It's more than food. It's life itself. It's much more amazing. John, same gospel, John chapter 3:17 said, for God did not send his son into the world to condemn it, to condemn the world. He didn't send Jesus to make things worse, but in order that the world might be saved through him. In other words, Jesus' message was all about life. It was about God's love and life being bestowed through Jesus. If you want to know what it's about, what God's purpose is, and what God's purpose is for us, there it is, that we might share news of life and love. Life and love. Now, some of you take notes, but sometimes you forget to grab the little notes that I put out in there that you can fill out, or maybe you didn't bring your pencil. I love this guy, Robert Brault, said, it's my luck that every time I feel completely that I comprehend God's plan, I don't have a pencil with me. So if you don't have a pencil with you right now, don't worry about remembering what I just said. Here's an easy way to remember what it means to be sent by God. So there you go. You don't need to remember a thing. Children Go. Anybody remember that song? Believe it or not, when I was working with Young Life back in the 70s, we actually had high school kids singing that song. Now, not quite like that, but we had guitars and things like that. We're singing Children Go. Do you remember the words? Do you know what for the four that stood at the door? 5 for the gospel. Preachers, you get an F. First service actually got that. 6 for the 6 that never got fixed. You can look it up later. So, how did God send Jesus? Children, go where I send thee. How did God send Jesus? To live, words of life, how to find real life, to love, to die, to serve, to teach, to heal, to follow God obediently, to fight injustice and oppression. It's an amazing list if you want to know how God sent Jesus. Children, this song we just listened to, Children Go Where I Send Thee, it's a traditional African-American spiritual. It's also called a cumulative song. You know what a cumulative song is? Come on, Heidi, you're a choir director. It's one that adds, they keep adding to. 1 for the little bitty baby, 2 for Paul and Silas, 3 for the Hebrew children. So it's a cumulative song. It builds and builds and grows and grows. Jesus wants us to live cumulative life. We compile more of knowledge, more of God's knowledge, more of life-giving experiences. We begin to compile these. That's why worship's important. That's why studying the Bible's important. We begin to have these compilation lives that keep getting added to day by day by day as our lives go on in Christ. So Jesus sends us out in this cumulative way because we have the capacity to add to others' lives out of our own knowledge, our own love, our ability to tell them where life is, to die in a sense to the things that aren't good for us, to serve, to teach, to heal, to be obedient, the list, to fight injustice and oppression. So would you say you have a cumulative spiritual life of faith or a one-time, and I'm all good, life of faith? See, the disciples up in that room, that's a one-time life of faith. It didn't become cumulative till they became sent ones, and then it started adding up. Then they started putting it to work. Unfortunately, I think many folks today that call themselves Christians or live by that word are still hiding away. We hide away our very best news behind the proverbial locked door. That's why it's so hard for us to tell people about our faith. We've locked it away a bit. It's going to be too hard or too scary. Or inviting somebody to church, we might do that, but I don't want to offend them. That's locked away behind a door. I've had a life-changing experience in my own life where I heard one in church, but I don't want to bother somebody with that. I want to impose. That's a locked door. If we're choosing this life of faith in Jesus Christ, but we'd rather be locked behind doors, locked away lives, we're choosing a life that's antithetical to actual real living. You're choosing lifelessness. You can't live like that, not according to Jesus' command. And Jesus' command came from God's. It's cumulative, passed on too. So what's your best news? Have you got great news you want to share? Just tremendous news that you can't wait to tell somebody about? Because really the disciples did have great news. And then when Pentecost came, they finally had the courage to unlock the door. Well, actually, the Holy Spirit did that. They unlocked the door and they told everybody about life and about love. What's your best news? Is it locked away? I want to share one story about some best news, the best gift maybe that I've ever received. Some of you are new to the church, but about 6 years ago, I think it was 5 or 6 years ago, My daughter Rachel, many of you know, some of you don't, was in a tremendous car accident, which left her in a coma with brain injury, traumatic brain injury. And part of that process was her being in the hospital. We wanted her to wake up, and week after week went by. And I remember coming in and reporting to you guys that, she's still in the hospital. She hasn't woken up. She hasn't woken up. But they told us just to keep talking to her, trying to rouse her to awareness. And we would do that. We'd talk to her. I'd ask her questions. And in my family, one of the things we do when it's time to leave, we always say, kind of our salutation is, or our goodbye is, I love you. We just say that, I love you. And they say it back, I love you. Sometimes it's accompanied with a hug. So I would often bend down and say, I'd have to come to church or whatever, go to work, bend down and say, I love you. And I'd listen, no response. I did that many times. I love you, no response. So you do that so often that you almost don't expect the response. So, it had been 3 weeks. And so, because we didn't know, they told us that she may not regain speech, she may not regain physical movement. There were a lot of things to the brain injury that could have happened that didn't. But time to go again. I lean down, get right near her, near to her face, and I say, I love you. And I hear in this very weak whisper, I love you too. And at first I thought, I made it up, right? Because I really wanted to hear it so bad. I was like, did she really say that? And she did. She began to wake up. It was in that moment that we knew that she was waking up. And that was a treasure. And it was a treasure. I could have kept that treasure locked away and not told anybody. But I couldn't wait to come back here that next Sunday and tell you that she was waking up and that she was speaking. That was wonderful. Back to the Gospel of John, chapter 17, verses 18 and 19 says, as you sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. He's talking about us. I've sent them into the world, and for their sake I consecrate myself, that they may also be sanctified in truth. The truth is this, and it's the truth of our message really, is that God bent low in Jesus Christ, bent low to us in Jesus Christ, and whispers, I love you. And that message is how Jesus was sent. And now so he sends us. I guess the point of all of this today and the message is to understand our sentness. You can call it apostleship, but it's really our sentness. Jesus says to the disciples, I'm sending you into the world. I want you to be my ambassadors, be my representatives, so that people that have never seen me can discover what I'm really like by observing your lives. Well, that sounds pretty heavy, and it is heavy, but it's wonderful because if what we get to represent is life and love, it's that great news, that's that treasure you want to share. So in this context, it's almost as if Jesus is saying, I really need you. I really need you to help me. I want you to do something for me. Because Christ was sent into the world to represent the invisible God. Colossians 1:15 says, for Jesus Christ was the visible expression of the invisible God. Christ was sent into the world to represent his invisible sender. That is God. That people who couldn't see would get sight. They couldn't see the Father, but they could see Jesus. And now people that say, I can't see Jesus, what's he really like? Jesus is saying, they'll know because I'm sending you in the same way. And I'm going to continue to reveal love and life and my nature. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it through you. I'm going to do it through the church. So here's your, if you want to write it down, or I'll play the song for you again. Here's your point. We've been sent into the world to represent the invisible Christ as his body. Jesus, as the head of the church, says, soon you'll see me no more. And he was right. But they can see us. They can see the body. And Jesus says, go where I send you. Amen.